Imagine tucking your child into bed, believing they are safe under your roof, only to wake in the middle of the night and find them standing in the hallway, eyes wide open yet utterly empty, whispering words in a language you cannot recognize. Imagine a mother gripping a snake with bare hands, grinning with a madness that erases all memory by sunrise. Imagine your child's best friend suddenly becoming someone else entirely, calling himself by a different name, whispering curses into the darkness. These are not ghost stories. These are not urban legends. These are real accounts of parents and children who stepped into the unexplainable and barely walked away. What would you do if the people you love most became the very thing you feared? Welcome to the Price Paida channel, where the veil between family and nightmare is ripped apart. Subscribe now, because what you are about to hear will follow you long after the video ends. When my son George was younger, he had a way of attracting the strangest friends. Even though he was bright, outgoing, and kind, he seemed to gravitate toward children who carried a certain heaviness with them. Kids who were different in ways you could not always put into words. The most unforgettable of these friendships began when George was in the 4th grade. We had just moved because of my husband's military reassignment, and George was adjusting to his new school. He'd always been talkative, friendly, and adaptable, so I was not worried about him making connections. As a family, we were settling in, meeting new neighbors, and finding our rhythm. George's teachers reported nothing but good things about him. When I first met the parents of his classmates, I felt reassured that he was surrounded by good people. Nothing about that period of our lives hinted at the darkness that was about to slip into it. One afternoon, I received a call from George's school. The principal wanted me to come in regarding an incident involving my son. My husband was at work, so I drove over, my stomach tightening the whole way. George had never been in trouble, never shown a violent side, so I feared the worst. When I picked him up from class, he was unusually silent. George was usually an open book, full of chatter and questions. But this time he avoided my eyes and refused to explain. That silence unsettled me more than any confession would have. In the principal's office, George was asked to wait outside while I was seated across the desk. The principal began with routine questions about George's behavior at home. Did he obey? Was he respectful? Did he ever lash out? I answered honestly, George was gentle, well-mannered, and kind-hearted. That was the truth, not just my mother's bias. Then the principal told me why I had been called in. According to reports, George had struck another boy named Sebastian over the head with an eraser, knocking him to the ground. The boy cried out in pain, and George admitted to the act. No adults had witnessed it, but both boys told the same story. I was stunned. George had never attacked anyone, and I knew he considered Sebastian a friend. The principal assured me that no punishment would follow since children sometimes fought, but he wanted me to be aware. Though relieved George was not in real trouble, I was left confused and uneasy. On the drive home, my son remained silent until just before bed. That was when he finally confessed. He explained that Sebastian had convinced him to act out a pretend move from a game they were playing, something like Street Fighter. George used the eraser because Sebastian told him to. Then Sebastian collapsed theatrically, whispering that George would be in serious danger if he did not play along and pretend it had been an attack. Terrified, George obeyed, and the teachers believed the scene was real. My anger boiled. My son had been manipulated and blamed for something he did not understand. Instead of involving the school again, I decided to confront Sebastian's family directly. That evening, I searched the directory and found his mother's number. She introduced herself as Maggie. To my surprise, she was warm and polite, even apologetic. She said Sebastian had already admitted the truth to her and that she had scolded him. She mentioned almost casually that Sebastian sometimes behaved like different people, slipping into roles that did not feel entirely his own. Doctors had brushed it off as something he would outgrow. She suggested a sleepover to mend the rift between the boys. I hesitated, but she was so genuine that I agreed. She would host, and I convinced myself it might be good for George to help Sebastian learn to be a friend. That weekend, George and I went to their home. Maggie welcomed me in with warmth, offered me wine, and we spent hours talking while the boys played in the basement. She seemed normal, compassionate, and completely honest. At one point, I asked about Sebastian's behavior. Her tone shifted. She lowered her voice, admitting that he struggled socially and sometimes seemed lost in another reality. But she reassured me he was never violent. I wanted to believe her. When I left George for the night, he seemed happy, playing Battleship with Sebastian, laughing like everything was fine. I drove home, comforted by the thought that the boys were bonding. The next morning, when I returned to pick him up, George greeted me with a smile. Maggie waved kindly from the doorway. Everything appeared normal until we drove away. George suddenly burst into tears, trembling so hard he could barely speak. What he told me made my blood run cold. He said that sometime during the night he awoke to whispering. The sound came from the basement bathroom, where a flickering candlelight glowed. George peeked and saw Sebastian speaking in hushed tones, but he was not calling himself Sebastian. He was calling himself Mr. Jim. He spoke to the mirror as if it were a person, muttering words George did not understand. The candle went out suddenly, and the room fell into darkness. George shut his eyes and pretended to be asleep, terrified. Later, he felt hot breath over him and heard whispering in a language that made no sense right above his face. Then, as though nothing had happened, Sebastian climbed back into bed and slept peacefully until morning. When George finished recounting this, I felt sick with dread. I immediately called Maggie. At first, she laughed nervously, dismissing George's story as exaggeration, claiming Sebastian was creative. But when I pressed, her voice faltered. She admitted that his issues were more severe than she had first told me. A psychiatrist had even suggested multiple personality disorder. She revealed they had already moved twice because of incidents at other schools. She begged me not to tell anyone else. I hung up, torn between sympathy and anger, and told myself I would decide what to do in a few days. But fate decided for me. That Monday, Sebastian violently attacked another student at recess. The school expelled him and released a vague notice to parents. When I tried to call Maggie, her phone was disconnected. Within days, I discovered their house was vacated, abandoned without warning. No forwarding address, no explanation, no trace of them at all. It was as if they had vanished from existence. Even years later, George seems unscarred by it, but I cannot forget. I still think about that night, about the whispering voice he heard in the dark, about the way Sebastian slipped into someone else entirely. Was it a disorder or was it something darker? I will never know, but the memory still haunts me. I often wonder what would have happened if George had not pretended to be asleep, or if Sebastian had decided to let Mr. Jim stay longer. The thought makes me shiver even now. I grew up in a Southern Baptist household where faith was not just encouraged, it was demanded. We were taught that ghosts were nonsense, but demons were real and ever present. Anything unexplained was not a lost soul wandering, but something far more sinister, something biblical. I never fully absorbed those teachings, but they shaped the way I viewed the strange things that happened around me. My mother was different from the rest of the family. Religion was optional for her. She claimed that God and she had an understanding. She was not atheist, not agnostic, just indifferent, almost careless. While I leaned on church for stability, she leaned away, drifting deeper into her own troubled mind. It created a gap between us that grew wider over the years. My mother struggled with more than faith. She battled addiction, mood swings, and mental health problems that she refused to acknowledge. Looking back now, I am certain she had schizophrenia, or something very similar. But in those days, mental illness was often ignored or brushed aside. Families did not know how to cope, and stigma kept people from seeking help. Some days she was completely functional, almost cheerful. On others, she slipped into a frightening state, irrational and unpredictable. It was like living with two versions of her, never knowing which one would open the bedroom door. One night, I had a dream that has never left me. In the dream, my mother stormed into my room screaming, her face twisted with rage, her hands gripping my wrist as she shook me violently. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced it was just my imagination. But minutes later, the nightmare replayed in real life. My bedroom door flew open, and there she was in the same fury, repeating the same words, her eyes wild. The dream had been a prophecy, or so it felt. I pushed her away and shouted, and just as quickly as it began, it ended. The next morning, she had no memory of it, no explanation, only confusion at my fear. She thought I was exaggerating. I told myself it was coincidence, but deep down I wondered if something far darker had slipped into her that night. Weeks later, another moment burned itself into my memory. I heard her screaming in the backyard. It was not a scream of fear or anger. It was joyous, almost celebratory. I ran outside, and what I saw froze me in place. My mother was standing barefoot in the yard, grinning from ear to ear, holding a massive snake, at least 7 feet long, in her bare hands. That alone was shocking. But here's the thing. My mother had a lifelong phobia of snakes. She could not watch them on television without recoiling, let alone touch one. Yet there she stood, clutching it as though it were a toy. She tilted her head, smiled wider, and told me to come closer. Her voice was calm, almost enticing. I shook my head, staring for her to stop, but her eyes seemed unrecognizable, as if she did not understand the words I was speaking. I bolted back inside, heart racing, slamming the door behind me. When I peeked out the window moments later, she was still there, offering the snake to the air like it was some kind of ritual. Eventually, she let it go and walked inside as if nothing had happened. Later, when I confronted her, she dismissed it. She said I must have been dreaming, her tone flat, her memory empty. That was when I started to question whether this was really mental illness alone. Months later, my church hosted an overnight lock-in. I was relieved for the break. Church was safe, predictable, and normal. My mother dropped me off sober, even kissed me on the forehead before leaving. The night went on as expected until around 4:30 in the morning. Just as we were settling into sleep, a loud knocking began. It echoed through the chapel walls, circling, moving in impossible ways. At times it came from one direction, then another, sometimes from all sides at once. It was rhythmic, intentional. My friends whispered nervously. It was not the wind. It was not an animal. Something was trying to come in. I ran to wake the pastor. He was the only one with keys. The moment he stepped into the room, the knocking stopped. He opened the doors, and what we saw made the blood drain from his face. My mother stood barefoot in the freezing night, her clothes wrinkled, her skin dripping with sweat. Her lips were moving, whispering words none of us could hear. She did not acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked on me, and a slow, unsettling smile stretched across her face. She stepped forward, and I felt powerless. The pastor tried to hold me back, murmuring for me to stay put, but I could not. Something in me felt pulled toward her. Against my will, I climbed into her car. The ride home was silent. She did not speak, did not answer when I asked why she was there. At home, she stopped at the doorway, staring at me as I walked to my room. She never moved, just watched, until I shut and locked the door. I lay awake until morning, shaking. When I finally ventured out, she was in the kitchen cooking breakfast, cheerful as ever. When I asked about the night before, she looked surprised, even offended. She said she had been planning to pick me up from church later that morning. She remembered nothing. The pastor never mentioned it again. The congregation never spoke of it. It was like the entire night had been erased, except in my memory. Years have passed since then. My mother is gone now, but the weight of her presence lingers. Sometimes I tell myself it was all the product of untreated mental illness, addiction, and hallucinations. Other times I remember the timing, the uncanny way my dreams predicted her actions, the unnatural way she behaved, and I cannot help but think of demons. The teachings of my childhood still whisper to me in the dark. I try to convince myself of rational explanations, but there are nights when I can still hear her knuckles pounding on the chapel doors, rhythmic, unrelenting, as if she was never outside at all but already inside, waiting. That thought chills me more than anything. When my eldest son was 8 or 9, he began sleepwalking. I had heard of children experiencing phases like that, so at first I did not worry. It seemed harmless, even if it was unnerving. I am a light sleeper, so none of my children could ever move around at night without me waking. That was how I first discovered his habit. Some nights, I would rise from bed and find him standing in the hallway, his body swaying slightly, his eyes open yet vacant. His gaze passed right through me as if I were invisible. It was the emptiness in his expression that unsettled me most. There was life in his body, but none in his eyes, like he was looking at something beyond what I could see. Sometimes he mumbled nonsense under his breath, too garbled to understand. Other times, he stood silently, breathing steadily, as if caught between two worlds. I would guide him gently back to bed, whispering his name, reassuring him. By morning, he never remembered. I convinced myself it was just another quirk of childhood, but then things escalated. One night, I woke to a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was a dream, some echo that followed me out of sleep. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate. It was too rhythmic to be rain or settling wood. When I listened closer, I realized it came from the hallway. My husband was asleep beside me, undisturbed, so I crept out quietly. There stood my son, pressing his forehead against the wall, knocking it in soft measured taps. His fingertips grazed the surface in rhythm, as though he were trying to push through. My heart froze. I whispered his name, but he did not move. I reached out and touched his shoulder. He blinked once, as if surfacing from water, then followed me back to bed without resistance. He remembered nothing the next morning. That scene repeated a few more times, always the same, always in the exact spot in the hallway. Eventually it stopped. He grew out of it, or so I thought. Years passed, and then it began again, but this time with my younger son. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence. Children mimic behaviors without realizing, I told myself. But my younger son had never seen his brother sleepwalk. He was too young to remember those nights. Yet the similarities were impossible to ignore. He stood in the hallway, his body shifting slowly, his eyes open but unseeing, his lips moving without sound. The first time I saw it, I felt an old dread return. Then one night, I woke to the tapping again. My stomach clenched, already knowing what I would find. And there he was, forehead pressed against the exact same spot, knocking gently as though the wall itself concealed something waiting for him. His fingers traced the surface the same way his brothers had years before. I called his name louder this time, but he did not stir. I shook his shoulder, and finally he blinked awake. His body loosened as if nothing unusual had happened, and I led him back to bed. By morning, he had no memory of it. The repetition was too precise, too identical to his brother's long-forgotten ritual. I could not accept it as simple chance. It made me feel sick. Both sons eventually grew out of it, just as suddenly as it had begun. The years went on. Life returned to normal. The episodes became distant memories, strange but buried. I might have forgotten entirely if not for what happened much later. With the children away at college, the house felt too quiet. My husband and I decided to renovate, freshen the place with new paint and floors. It was lighthearted work until the day we stripped away the old wallpaper in the hallway. Behind it was not plaster or wood, but glass. We uncovered an antique-style mirror, tall and narrow, built directly into the wall and hidden for decades. Dust clung to its surface, and the frame was ornate, almost funereal. My first thought was confusion. Why would anyone cover a mirror instead of removing it? Then my breath caught. The mirror stood exactly where both of my sons had pressed their foreheads, knocking night after night, as though drawn to it without knowing it was there. They could not have seen it, they could not have known. Yet somehow, in their sleep, they had been reaching for it. I remember standing frozen, staring into that glass. For a moment, I thought I saw movement. Not my own reflection, but something behind me. I told myself it was the shock, the dust, the dim light playing tricks. But the feeling that I was not supposed to find it gnawed at me. I insisted we remove it immediately. We pried it out of the wall and carried it outside, setting it down on the curb for disposal. Even touching it felt wrong, like handling something tainted. Afterward, I tried to calm myself with rational explanations. Maybe the boys were unconsciously drawn to that spot for reasons unrelated to the mirror. Maybe it was pure coincidence. Still, the discovery unsettled me in ways logic could not repair. Nights afterward, when the house was quiet, I sometimes thought I heard that faint tapping again. My mind told me it was memory, just echoes of the past. But every creak of the house sent my heart racing. I could picture my sons in the hallway, their foreheads against that hidden mirror, trying to slip into a place no one should ever reach. I tell myself it was nothing more than sleepwalking, but the thought of what they might have seen, even in dreams, chills me. I cannot explain how two children, years apart, repeated the same exact actions in front of an object that should not have been known to them. And I cannot forget the way my hands trembled as I helped carry that mirror outside, afraid of what might be staring back from the other side. Some things are best left covered, and perhaps that is why someone long before us had sealed it away. Families are supposed to be safe havens, the places we turn to when the rest of the world feels uncertain. Yet the stories I have lived through, and the ones shared by others, remind me that sometimes the most disturbing events happen within those walls. George and his strange friendship with Sebastian, my own mother's terrifying transformations, and the mirrored rituals of my children all share a common thread: the unknown slipping into ordinary life. Each moment forced me to question reality, to decide whether what I saw was born of illness and imagination, or whether something darker was intruding where it did not belong. When I think of George's experience, I still see his terrified eyes as he described Sebastian whispering to the mirror, claiming to be someone else entirely. On the surface, it could be dismissed as a child's game taken too far, a troubled boy acting out fantasies. But the way it ended haunts me. The sudden violence at school, the family's disappearance without a trace, the disconnected number in the vacated house, it was as if they had been erased. Rational explanations fall short when people vanish into thin air. I wonder what became of Sebastian, if the persona of Mr. Jim still lingers in him, or if he carried that shadow elsewhere. The thought that he might still be out there unsettles me in ways I cannot shake. Then there is the memory of my mother. Some would argue her behavior was the product of untreated mental illness, a mind breaking under the weight of addiction and inner demons of a different kind. Yet even now I cannot explain the timing, the dreams that predicted her actions, the night she appeared at the church as if called by something unseen. I can still feel the way her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a knowing I cannot put into words. When she stood outside the chapel, knocking in that rhythmic, impossible way, it did not feel human. I tried to tell myself it was madness, but the part of me raised to believe in biblical evil cannot dismiss the possibility that something else was moving through her. Perhaps it was mental illness, perhaps possession, or perhaps both, braided together in a way that made her into someone unrecognizable. I will never know, and that uncertainty is its own form of terror. And then there is the mirror. The discovery still fills me with dread. Both of my sons, years apart, sleepwalked to the same exact spot, knocking their heads against the wall where the mirror had been hidden. They could not have known it existed, and yet their unconscious bodies found it without fail. I asked myself what they were reaching for. Did the mirror hold some energy that drew them in, or did they sense something beyond the surface? Something that called to them in the night? The idea that children can touch the edges of a reality adults pretend not to see is chilling. When we pulled that mirror out, I half expected something to resist, something not willing to let go. Even now, with it gone, I sometimes feel that the space on the wall still hums with what was once sealed away. I try to sleep soundly, but the memory of their small bodies swaying against that wall lingers in the dark corners of my mind. What unites all these experiences is the absence of clear answers. Were these events symptoms of disturbed minds? Were they coincidences magnified by fear? Or were they glimpses into the supernatural? Moments where the veil between our world and something else thinned just enough to let horror seep through. The scariest part is not knowing. Logic wants to reduce everything to explanations we can live with. But sometimes logic feels like a thin blanket against a storm. No matter how tightly you wrap yourself, the cold finds its way in. I have lived long enough to know that certainty is a luxury. When your child cries about whispers in the dark, when your parent behaves like a stranger with no memory of their actions, when your home itself seems to harbor secrets, doubt becomes permanent. You start to question not just the events, but your own sanity, your own ability to separate truth from terror. Perhaps that is the cruelest truth. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They linger in the cracks of our lives, waiting for quiet moments to resurface. They remind us that safety is fragile, that family can be both comfort and curse, and that the things we do not understand are often the things we fear most. Every time I recall George's trembling voice, my mother's smile in the darkness, or my children knocking against that hidden mirror, I am reminded that horror does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it looks like the people you love most. Sometimes it hides in the walls of your own home. And sometimes it disappears without leaving a single trace, leaving you only with the questions that will never be answered. In the end, I do not know if what I experienced was madness or malevolence, accident or evil. But I know this: those nights changed me forever. They taught me that family secrets can be darker than any stranger's cruelty, and that the most terrifying stories are the ones that refuse to end. Even now, when silence fills the house, I find myself listening, waiting, bracing for the sound of tapping in the hallway or knocking at the door, wondering if the past is really gone or if it is only waiting to return. When you hear stories like these, it is tempting to dismiss them as exaggerations, misunderstandings, or the side effects of troubled minds. But when they happen inside your own family, when the strange and the terrifying unfold in your own home, the line between rational and irrational begins to blur. George's experience with Sebastian reminds us that children are vulnerable, easily manipulated, and often forced to carry secrets far heavier than their young shoulders can bear. His encounter with Mr. Jim is a chilling reminder that sometimes the people closest to our children can be the ones who place them in danger. It teaches us to listen carefully when our children tell us about their fears, even if those fears sound impossible. The story of my mother is a different kind of warning. Mental illness, addiction, and untreated trauma can twist a person into someone unrecognizable, someone dangerous, even if unintentionally. But when her behavior crossed the line into the unexplainable, I was left with questions that still follow me. Was she sick, possessed, or both? The truth may never be clear, but the lesson is: families cannot afford to ignore signs of instability, whether it is psychological, spiritual, or something we cannot name. Acknowledging it is the first step to protecting those we love. And then there is the mirror. My sons' sleepwalking rituals led them to a hidden object neither could have known about. That discovery was not only unsettling, it was a reminder that houses hold histories we do not always see. Old walls keep secrets. Some are harmless,
Help us.
others less so. If you ever encounter something that does not feel right, whether an object, a place, or a behavior that repeats without explanation, trust your instincts. Sometimes removing the source, even without a clear reason, is the only way to regain peace. Taken together, these stories show us that horror does not live only in abandoned buildings or shadowed forests. It lives in our children's whispers, in our parents' eyes when they forget themselves, and in the very walls of our homes. The most frightening stories are not the ones you read in books or watch in movies. They are the ones you live through quietly, the ones you rarely tell because you are not sure anyone will believe you. But whether born of sickness, spirit, or coincidence, their impact is the same. They leave scars that do not fade. So what can you do if you find yourself in the middle of such a nightmare? First, take it seriously. Do not laugh it off or explain it away too quickly. Second, protect those who cannot protect themselves, especially children. Third, seek help, remove yourself from danger, or eliminate the source when possible. The unknown is terrifying, but doing nothing is far worse. These stories are reminders that vigilance, compassion, and courage are sometimes the only defenses we have. You have just heard the price families paid when the ordinary became extraordinary, when safety turned into terror. And now I ask you, are you ready to face the truths that hide in your own home? Subscribe to The Price Paid and join us as we uncover more stories that will make you question everything you thought was safe.